What are blackletter fonts? Well, if you're someone who's like me and at some point in the past you've had Microsoft Word open and you've just gone through lots of the different fonts that you can choose and put some text into those fonts to see what they look like, you've probably come across this font, Old English Text MT. And I've put a word here, this word minimum, in this font on the screen here. A word like minimum, where it's got lots of M's and I's and N's and R's and even O's as well. Actually, let me just check the letter O. Yeah, a word that has lots of letters like that, and it's very good for showcasing the properties, the qualities of a blackletter font. Old English Text is a blackletter font that's available in Microsoft Word. There aren't that many that are available, at least easily, in Microsoft Word. It's quite an uncommon type of font generally, but we'll get onto that in a moment. What are blackletter fonts? Well, this is Old English Text is an example of a blackletter font. If you're a user of Microsoft Word, it's probably the example, one of the first examples that you've seen if you have just gone through and tried different fonts. It's an okay example of a blackletter font. It's certainly better than some that I've seen, but it's also a little bit simplified, I think, in a sense, compared to some other blackletter fonts. So what are the characteristics of a font like this that make it a blackletter font? Well, as I say, with a word like minimum, with lots of these vertical components to the letters, you can really see distinctive features of a blackletter font. So, I mean, if we just you can look at any of these letters, and you can see that for each of these vertical parts of the letters, you've got that sort of thick vertical component, and then you've got these sort of squarish bits on the end, which are on both ends. So you've got on this lower section, there's a sort of almost squarish bit, and you can see it a little bit on the top sections as well. I mean, with an M, you can see there's almost like a stroke that comes slightly down diagonally and then goes vertically, and that happens a few times. But with the I, you've got that very squarish form on the top, and it just has a sort of upward tick on the bottom of it. And then you also have these very, very thin diagonal lines going up to the right, which happens at the end of the I here. It goes. There's you can sort of imagine a very thin diagonal line going up there at the end of here and just here as well. And these are the characteristics of a blackletter font, because to a very great extent, blackletter fonts are trying to emulate a kind of script that was done, certainly to begin with, by hand when it comes to writing out text, and then later done with metal type, and then now, of course, with digital fonts. And the reason why you have these sort of squarish forms on the end here and these thick vertical lines, it's quite difficult to show, actually, just with a mouse in Microsoft Word. But if you imagine you had a quill or some sort of a pen which you would have to dip into an inkwell that had a metal nib on the end of it, and if you imagine that nib is a piece of metal it's quite wide and it's quite flat. If you were to pull that across the page, you get this very thick squarish line to it. Or if you do a short line, you get a very sort of thick squarish shape to it. And then if you drag it down, you also get that shape. But because you've got this very the nib is a wide but flat piece of metal, when you then if you're right-handed, if you then move up diagonally, then you get a very narrow line. So what's going on here is these top sections, that's where you draw the pen down diagonally to the right, and then when you go down, you turn your hand a little bit, and then you pull down, and you get another thick line. And then when you go up to the right, you're moving along the sort of the thin sort of axis of the nib, so you get these very thin lines. So you can imagine if you start by you draw the quill down there, and then you lift it off, and you make another sort of diagonal draw there to get the square end, and then you go diagonally up here to get the thin line, and then down again, draw off with a square end, and so on. And that's how you get these shapes. Those shapes were then replicated in metal font and now in digital fonts. So that's what blackletter fonts are really trying to do. It's trying to emulate that style of script with metal nib pens that you would dip in inkwells. In modern blackletter fonts, you get a little bit of variation from that. People, when they're designing the fonts, they can vary it a bit. They can do things that actually would be quite difficult to do with that kind of pen. And that kind of brings me on to a point that I alluded to earlier, which is that so there's not that many blackletter fonts available by default in Microsoft Word, and it's certainly I found when going around online trying to find blackletter fonts, it's actually really hard to find a good one. And in this case, by good one, I mean one that's actually quite authentic to how this kind of text was written historically. I'm certainly very interested in seeing blackletter fonts that mimic those historical qualities that that really, really look like how things were written when they were done by hand. And it's quite unusual. I don't think I've ever found one that's like that. There probably is one somewhere available somewhere, but I've certainly never found one. I actually have just down here a picture that I grabbed from Wikipedia that shows some handwritten blackletter text, and you can see already some differences between the Old English text font and some actual blackletter as it originally was. Here we've got so this is just using the default letter spacing between the letters in the font, and you can see there's very clear spaces between the letters that makes it a bit easier to read. I mean, a font like this is still quite difficult to read for the modern English reader, but having these spaces makes it a bit easier. If we look down at this historical example, you can see actually that the letters are much closer together, in some cases seeming to like join together. Well, actually, in a lot of cases they join together just by a thin bit, but in some cases they really, really seem to join together. Like when you have something like this word here, it's actually quite difficult to tell. Those thin sections are so thin that sometimes it's almost as though you can't see them, and the vertical sections are so close together it just looks like lots of these vertical lines together with a few variations here and there. This is how things were done historically. For the modern English reader, this is actually very difficult, even just with the eye, to distinguish what's going on. I mean, I've sort of read a certain amount of text in blackletter over the last few years, but I find this very, very difficult to read in full. I think that's familias there, but goodness knows what this word is. There's also other things making this more difficult, like I believe we've got the long S in various places, which is something I'll make another video on. I think that's nomia there as well. But this sort of thing is very, very difficult for the modern English reader to actually pass and to understand. So I think this is both why we don't see that many blackletter fonts available. We don't, they're not so many are designed compared to the more modern serif and sans serif fonts. That's why we don't see so many of them, and it's also why we don't see so many very historical ones, because this is hard to read. This is a bit easier. I can certainly read text that's been written in this, but still, I mean, if we make this smaller, that can still, I mean, look, that's size 22, which is still pretty big, and obviously you're looking at this on a screen, so it's probably even harder. But as we get smaller, that's pretty difficult to scan with the eye, which is why they're not really used so much. Whereas someone centuries ago might have found this a lot easier to read. So that's what blackletter fonts are. They, this was simply how text was written in a lot of Europe, including in Britain, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. This was just the normal style of writing, for at least for like formal texts. and it, this was replaced later by like old style serif fonts, and then newer style serif fonts and sans serif fonts and so on. But it emulates the qualities of a metal pen on paper, and nowadays they're a little bit hard to. It's a bit hard to find good ones, and they're a bit hard to use. In terms of where you would use a font like this, how you'd use a font, well, this channel is about book formatting, and its main focus is on novels and fiction books. Would you use a font? Where would you use a font like this in a fiction book? Well, you almost certainly wouldn't use it for the main text of the book, because of those reasons that I've already mentioned. Of a lot of people find this very, very difficult to read. I mean, it would be an interesting artistic experiment to write something, maybe not a really, really long novel, but maybe something like a short story in a text like this, or in a font like this, to see how it comes out, to see, does it change the mood of the story. You might have a story that is set in a time when this kind of text would have been common, though this kind of font would have been common. In which case it might be quite interesting to see it formatted in something like this. Perhaps not Old English text. Old English text it's a bit of a sort of stereotypical black letter font, and perhaps not. Doesn't, as I say, it doesn't capture those historical qualities so well. But it might be an interesting artistic experiment to use black letter for something like that. But for the most part, it's very difficult to pass. So you wouldn't use it in the main text, the main paragraph text of your book. You could probably get away with it in chapter headings. You could even use it on the cover for your book. In fact, that's something that quite a lot of people do, because it is much more of an aesthetic font nowadays. Of course, for some bizarre reason, blackletter fonts have an affinity nowadays with tattoos and tattoo shops, which I'm not quite sure how that came about, but it's not unusual to see. I mean, I think I used to walk past a tattoo shop which would have its name written in this kind of font. Again, because it's thought of as a much more artistic, much more aesthetic font nowadays. So I guess that's why it's ended up with that affinity. But you could certainly use these kinds of fonts on covers and maybe in chapter headings, and in a few other artistic places in the book. But this entire class of font, when it comes to the core formatting of your book, the actual paragraph text, you would just completely discount it because of the difficulties in reading it. So that's what a blackletter font, in broad terms, is, and that's where you might use it in something like a novel.